Good morning students. So in this class we are going to discuss about kinetic friction. So if an external force acting on the object is greater than the maximum static friction, then the object begins to move. So when the object moves means the surface exerts a frictional force, that is kinetic frictional force. So it is also called sliding or dynamic friction. So consider an object. It is at rest. We are applying external force. Again it is at rest because of that static frictional force. So at one point the external force is greater than the particular limit, so the object begins to move. So after that the surface exerts a frictional force, that is kinetic friction. So the object moves with constant velocity. Then Fk equal to mu k n. So mu k is a coefficient of kinetic friction. So n is a normal force, that is mass and gravity. So here mu k is less than mu s. That means so the kinetic, that is coefficient of kinetic friction is less than the coefficient of static friction. That means here the starting, so the object is at rest, so to move an object is more difficult than maintain it. That is the meaning for that. So if we see that graph, that external force versus that frictional force. So initially here we are applying the force, so after that the frictional force acts in opposite direction, the object is at rest. Again that external force is linearly varies with the static frictional force. So at one point that Fs max reaches the maximum, after that the object begins to move. So after that the frictional force is kinetic friction, but here the kinetic friction force is constant. That is, we are applying whatever the force, external force, the kinetic friction force is constant, but here that F external is equal to that static frictional force. So if you increase the external force, that frictional force is also increases. So that is linearly varies, but here the kinetic frictional force is constant. So whatever the external force, so we are increasing, that is in x-axis, but there is no change in y-axis, that is kinetic frictional force is constant. So static friction increases linearly with the external force till it reaches the maximum. So at the maximum point object begins to move. Then the kinetic friction is slightly lesser than the maximum static friction. Just see that Fs maximum is slightly greater than the kinetic friction. Then so kinetic friction is constant, that is Fk value is constant and is independent of applied force. So whatever the applied force, that kinetic friction constant, that is Fk is constant. And final one, that Fs is equal to mu s n, it's not a vector relation. So it's a force, here also it's a normal force. So both are act in a different direction or not in the same direction, but that Fs is equal to mu s times n, it's not a vector equation. And also it is true for that kinetic friction. So Fk equal to mu k n. So in this class we have discussed what's my kinetic friction. So what is the relation between that static frictional force and kinetic frictional force.